Hello everyone and welcome to the first video in our series on team building and competitive Coromon. If you enjoy Coromon and other monster taming content, please make sure to like and subscribe, and let's jump in. The first thing we're going to review today is how easy it is to get into competitive Coromon. There have been a lot of quality of life changes that have made it very easy to get specific traits, skills, and other items that make you more effective in competitive Coromon. One of the most common questions that we get for those who are new to competitive Coromon is, do I have to have perfect Coromon to play competitively? And thankfully the answer is no, you do not need perfect Coromon to play competitive Coromon online. Thanks to a recent quality of life update, each Coromon that plays online has 126 potential points available, which is the same amount that would be available if your Coromon had perfect potential. Additionally, all 126 potential points can be redistributed on the online UI, and you don't need to do any training in-game to make your Coromon competitively viable. Also, regardless of what trait your Coromon has, you can select a new trait, and ideally a more competitively viable trait, via the UI when you play online. And you can also change your skills online as well, and you can also change the stage in which your Coromon presents during your online battle. All this to say, it's extremely easy to get into competitive Coromon. All you need is your Coromon leveled up to make sure it's attained all the skills you may want to use, make sure it's fully evolved so you can pick all the stages, maybe have some skill flashes and other items that you need, and other than that, you're ready to start playing competitive Coromon. And if you're one of the people that heard me say all that and you still think it's not easy enough to get into competitive Coromon and the barrier to entry is too high, there are also lone squads you can use that you can randomize that require no effort on your end other than clicking the lone squad and then going to a battle. So extremely easy to get into competitive Coromon. But now what I want to talk about are the types of roles you want to fill on your team to hopefully lead you to the top of the leaderboard. So what we'll do is start with some of the more basic roles on your team and then get progressively more complex, in my opinion. And we'll start with walls. So typically you'll want to have a physical wall, which uses the Maka Stone typically, and you'll want a special wall which might use the Pekka Stone potentially. A good example of a viable special wall would be Malavite that very often does run the Pekka Stone. While you can use it for other roles, the role that we're going to highlight is the special wall with max HP and max special defense. It's really great on switching into things like Volbrute, which can be a real pain. You can also switch into Glamoth really well, which is a really great special attacker. And of course, because of his type advantage and special bulk, is a great answer to Toravolt, which is a very prominent special attacker as well. And while those are specific examples that I'm giving, Malavite in general is a really great special wall, and I want to talk about Chonktoad, who is a very good physical wall with the Maka Stone. Chonktoad will typically run max defense, max HP with the Maka Stone, and is a great switch into things like Chiraptor, Yuka-Claw, Malavite, and other physical attacking Coromon. These two roles are very important for your team, as they're going to be your primary switch-ins to physical and special attackers. Ideally, you want to have some kind of type synergy, which we'll talk about in later videos, but these are your initial line of defense against physical and special attackers, and usually your first switch into either one of those. Now, a role that is very similar to Wall is called a tank. Typically, a tank will be a bulky Coromon that can take hits and dish out a lot of damage. Volbrute is a good example of that, because Volbrute's a good example of most things, but Volbrute can come in on a lot of physical attackers, or even special attackers if you train it that way. Take a hit, and then deal a lot of damage with high base power moves and high offensive stats. So, it's a balance between your offense and defense, but those are typically good to have as well, and you may get creative with how you make your tanks. For example, a Lantern is typically used as a physically defensive wall, but you may decide to run it with max HP, max special attack to take advantage of some of its offensive stats. But Volbrute's a much better example of a more traditional tank, but what you're trying to do is balance your offense and defense to take a hit and deal a lot of damage back. It's good to have a combination of both physical and special attackers to ensure that your team isn't walled by one type of wall. So if you only brought physical attackers and your team, and your opponent I should say, has a bunch of physical walls, you're in for a bad time because you can't really break them. What you want to do is bring in your special attacker to attack their weaker defensive side. With that being said, physical attackers and special attackers can also hold other roles on your team. Some of those roles might be setup sweeper, some of those roles might be wall breaker, and one example of a wall breaker would be Chiraptor and or Borealis that have really high physical attacking stats that even if you are physically defensive, unless you resist that hit, you're still taking a lot of damage from that skill. Conversely, you can see the same thing on the special side. Torbolt's another really great example with something like Bolt Bomb that has a high base power skill that does a lot of damage if you don't resist it, even if you do have a lot of special defense investment. Wall breakers have a different role than sweepers or cleaners in that they're more effective in the early to mid game in weakening your opponent's team, so something else that is a cleaner or sweeper can come in and finish your opponent's team off. Sweepers or cleaners are typically going to have a few things that differentiate them from wall breakers. One, they will have like a setup move that increases their speed and offensive stat to allow them to outspeed other Coromon on the opposing team to win the match. Or if they're a cleaner, they'll typically have higher speed without boosting, lower offensive stats, but still enough to finish off a team. A great example of a cleaner is Octo, who has the trait Motivated, which will increase your attack and special attack by 1 stage when you KO another Coromon. After your team is sufficiently weakened and you get up 1 boost, you snowball into sweeping or cleaning the opposing team. Before we move to more status or hazard oriented roles, I do want to talk about setup sweepers in Coromon because they're a little bit different than in other monster taming games like Pokemon, for example. In Coromon, typically you're going to see bulky setup sweepers that are boosting an offensive stat and a defensive stat. Volbrute again is a good example of this with a trapping move, Constricting Flames, which then allows Volbrute to use Inner Peace, which raises its special attack and special defense to make it even bulkier and hit even harder. Next, let's talk about hazards, which are status moves that cause damage upon entry to the battlefield. There are multiple different kind of hazards in Coromon. Some examples include Spike Trap, Electromine, Blazing Coals, and they each have different effects. The entry hazards in Coromon have different effects, so for example Spike Trap will damage an opposing Coromon entering the battlefield, assuming it's not floating and you don't have 3 layers up. Blazing Coals will damage the opponent and burn them as well, so you have chip damage every time the Coromon is on the field for every turn. Things like Electromines don't damage the opponent, but they do reduce the amount of SP, and moves like Haunted Grounds and Cursed Grounds will reduce your special attack and your attacking stat. In addition to your walls, tanks, setup sweepers, physical, special attackers, all of those things, entry hazards really help you gain an advantage against your opponent in having chip damage turn per turn, lowering your opponent's SP, or lowering their stats upon entry, which are really important considerations when building a team and prepping to battle another researcher. A Coromon that does a great job of utilizing entry hazards is Golbeak, arguably the best Coromon in the game right now, and they use Spike Trap, which is going to damage the opponent upon entry. Some of the Ghost type Coromon have Cursed Grounds or Haunted Grounds, which again will lower attack and special attack. And things like Haunted Ground will have Electromines, which is going to again lower your SP. So as you're building your team, you're thinking about your team composition. Do I have wall breakers? Do I have sweepers? Do I have tanks? Do I have walls? But do I also have something that can set hazards that's going to give me an advantage against my opponent? The last major role we'll talk about is entry hazard removal or hazard control. Currently, the only way to remove hazards is to use the skill Clearing Wind, which things like Golbeak get, Infinix get, and other Coromon. This is going to remove hazards from your side of the field and your opponent's side, so keep that in mind when you use it. But as you're building your team, you definitely want to have some kind of removal so that your opponent doesn't get hazards up turn 1, and then have an advantage the entire rest of the match. The last miscellaneous roles to talk about are status spreaders and status absorbers. For the most part in Coromon, you're going to see status spreaders, so something that's going to use like Toxic Cloud or Ignite, which is going to poison or burn your opponent. There's also things that are going to shock them, which make them likely not to move. But keeping in mind that if you do have certain statuses that you want to inflict on your opponent, you may want to have a Coromon or 2 that has a status move or a trait that enacts status. Not as crucial as the other roles we talked about, but wanted to name that as you get more advanced in your team building. And before we end the video, I wanted to preview the Coromon damage calculator created by Verit that's very useful, but most importantly for this video, has a really cool feature that will allow you to look at different team roles that you may want to fill. Make sure you select the newest version, and once you've made a copy, you'll go down to roles, and then here, depending on the type of role you want to fill, you'll have a pre-selected Coromon that you can slot into that role in team build. So a very useful calculator with really nice little sprites that I highly recommend you check out as you're building out your team and as you're trying to fill out certain roles on your team. And that will do it for part 1 of our intro to competitive Coromon and team building. After watching this, you should have a sense of how to get started with Coromon, the types of roles that you want to fill for your team, and the types of Coromon that can fill those roles. If you're excited for part 2, enjoy Coromon or other monster taming content, please make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you soon. Alright, bye.